Let's get started with Senator Adams on Senate Bill 1252. Welcome to committee, Senator. Just introduce yourself and time is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, committee. Good morning. My name is Ben Adams, Senator from District 12, Nampa, and appreciate this hearing and appreciate the interest that this committee has taken in this legislation. So what this legislation does is this really calls us back to what the Constitution intended for us as a nation, and that is specifically that Congress has the authority to declare war. It's articulated in Article 1 of the United States Constitution. That's where the power is vested. This specifically addresses our state militia. Our state militia, up until 1933, it was unquestionable they belonged to the state until Congress declared war. And based on a interpretation of a court ruling, we've built a massive military industry, and our National Guard has been used without Congress declaring war, not since World War II. So just to remind the committee, so Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15 says that Congress has the authority to call forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrection, and repel invasion, not the executive branch, and certainly not the administrative branch. Now, how do we know the intent behind Article 1 vesting the war powers in Congress instead of the executive branch? Well, James Madison, the father of the United States Constitution, said, and I'm going to quote here, "The Constitution supposes what the history of all governments demonstrates, that the executive is the branch of power most interested in war and most prone to it. It has accordingly with studied care vested the question of war in the legislature." Let's see. So we do have, our Guard does have a federal mission and a state mission. However, that federal mission has been interpreted as whenever, for whatever, without objection. And the next question that I usually get is, well, why isn't Congress dealing with this? And I would say they should. Congress absolutely should reclaim their war powers from the executive branch. But we have 4 branches of government. In my estimation, we have the judicial, the executive, the legislative, and the administrative branch in Washington, D.C. And Congress is located right next to that administrative branch that has facilitated where we are at today. However, the states have a right and a responsibility to stand up for their citizens. I'm going to quote James Madison again. "The states have the right and are duty bound to interpose for arresting the progress of the evil and for maintaining with their respective limits the authorities, rights, and liberties appertaining to them." This legislation brings us right back to the Constitution. Every argument that can be raised against this legislation ultimately runs into Article 1 of the United States Constitution. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I can answer questions. If not, I'd like to yield time to Mr. Dan McKnight.
Are there questions at this point? Senator Wintrow.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Senator Adams, I appreciate your introduction and the big picture. Would you be willing just to kind of talk through some of the particulars of what the bill does, because I had a question really about the active duty combat, what that means, and how that would impact any of our folks right now that are deployed, and where would they be? Does that make sense?
Senator Adams.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Winthrow, so active duty combat is, active duty combat is a definition that the Department of Defense already defines. As far as current service members that are deployed, I'm not aware of any that are in active duty combat zones right now. However, for an example, last year, the Idaho National Guard had service members in Syria, which is considered an active duty combat zone. And so if this legislation was to go into effect, if the Department of Defense were to call up Idaho's militia to deploy overseas into a combat zone, it would be on the governor to tell them, no, I can't. That is against state law.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Senator Adams, and forgive me for my ignorance about the military, but is active combat, like, is it, anywhere, it seems to me that there's a lot of places that people could be harmed if they're deployed overseas or in different countries where there's a lot of conflict. Could you maybe just describe that a little bit to say what that active conflict would be? Does that make sense? Like that combat zone?
Sure.
Adams.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Winthrow, any service member that's abroad, whether they are in Kuwait or in France or in England, if they're attacked, they can defend themselves. Defense is not on the table. And I would also point you to lines 22 through 28, which defines what active duty combat is intended to mean.
Don't see any other questions. Did you say Mr. McKnight?
Yes, please, Mr. Chairman.
Will you yield, Mr. McKnight? Please come up. Introduce yourself for the record, who you represent, and welcome to committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the Idaho Senate State Affairs Committee. My name is Dan McKnight. I'm a resident of Eagle, Idaho, 13-year veteran of the United States Marine Corps, the United States Army, and the Idaho Army National Guard. I served in Afghanistan from 2005 to 2007, and I came home injured, angry, and confused. And I started an organization. I'm not here representing them today, but the organization is a national veterans nonprofit called Bring Our Troops Home. And collectively, our tens of thousands of members are mostly from the global war on terror. And we support this legislation as an organization, but I'm here speaking as a citizen of Idaho. As members of the 67th Idaho legislature, you have the privilege and the weight of answering minor and major questions. Today, we're going to talk about a major question that requires a little bit of reflection on history and considering the implications of change going forward. And it's a testament to our democratic process that these questions actually can be answered at the state level by senators who are accountable to the people. 12 years ago, 1 decade into the global war on terror, this legislation first made its appearance in Maine, where it went before a committee very similar to this, and it left with a minority report, and only 7 members of the entire House of Representatives in Maine voted in favor of the legislation. I'm hoping that today, after another decade of endless undeclared wars, that maybe we can have a little bit of a different outcome. And I want to present as much as I can in as little time as possible. I understand your time is very valuable, and we're getting towards the end of the session, and things are starting to move pretty quick. We've learned a lot of lessons. 20 years of undeclared forever wars in which the National Guardsmen have accounted for over 45% of the total number of boots on the ground in these foreign conflicts. Most of these wars have been condemned locally and nationally by almost every veteran organization like the American Legion. So the question being asked more frequently in state houses across the country is this: should we defend our Guard? Legislative bodies in Georgia, Arizona, Montana, committees have already passed this out of their committee chambers onto the House or the Senate floors. And last year, the Senate in Arizona passed this bill with unanimous Republican support. The New Hampshire House of Representatives passed it this year. It's the largest legislative body in the Western world with an overwhelming bipartisan support. And then it came back to Arizona Senate again this year and passed again. It's going next Tuesday before the entire state of Texas as a ballot initiative brought forward, and the citizens of Texas will get to vote. Early polling has it in the 75% approval rating. This is a time for this legislation. This is a time for the citizens to reclaim their authority through the state legislatures. So the question is this: after generations of foreign warfare since the end of World War II, unchecked by the explicitly required separation of powers between the legislative and the executive branch, should state withhold their consent to the deployment of our state National Guardsmen into foreign wars that lacks the proper constitutional authorization of a congressional declaration of war? That's the question. That's the entirety of the question. So with my time, I'm going to present a brief overview of the problem, why this legislation is the solution, and preemptively answer some of the questions you may hear from opposition. Following me, you'll hear from other veterans that have different experiences, and they'll share their stories, and I hope you'll listen to them and question them as necessary. So the problem, I believe we all know, at least at a gut level, that there is something wrong with the way our brothers and sisters in uniform are treated by Washington, D.C. We swear an oath to the Constitution just as you do. Ours comes with a price tag of life and limb. To fulfill our oath, we promise to go anywhere, to fight anybody, for any length of time, for any reason that we're commanded. We don't get to question orders when we wear the uniform. That's why it's time, when you take the uniform off, to seek proper restoration of the authorities. When we deploy, we leave our families behind. We leave jobs behind. It creates an accordion effect on the economy. Our jobs are backfilled by members of our local economy, and when we return, we are guaranteed our jobs back, which displaces the replacement employees. It's an accordion effect that never stops. When we return from war, we return with physical and mental scars. The USO says veteran suicide rates post 9/11 are at the highest ever recorded level, twice what the general population is, and 4 times what it's ever been in any other recorded military history. So we can acknowledge the human flaws of our framers of our Constitution. They were men. Many of them had flaws. But they were wise to put the accountability and the authority for war in the legislative branch. Senator Adams talked about that, so I'm going to skip over. But even with that authority properly placed, it's been 82 years since Congress declared war. 82 years. By the most conservative definitions, that's 5 entire generations of human beings. So instead, our country has undergone unrelenting warfare through Asia, Central America, Northern Africa, the Middle East, and now, just this morning, we watched as there was an attack on U.S. troops in Eastern Europe. We're fighting the same wars over and over and over again. So commonplace today that it's become literally background noise to 99.5% of the population who has no direct ties to the military. Without a declaration of war, our representatives in Congress, they're never held accountable for the mission. Never. The people don't have a way to hold generals accountable. Our accountability is through the legislature. So we only need to look at the Afghanistan papers that came out recently just to understand that there is a disaster that's happening on the world front. The longest war in American history, top military brass advisors and generals and strategists admitted behind closed doors that they never had a clear mission. They didn't understand success. They didn't know what it meant to win the war. They didn't even know what the mission was. And at one point in time, the commander-in-chief didn't even know who was in charge of the war in Central Asia. That's an abomination. It's just become a payday for the private interests who supply the effort. The war existed to perpetuate itself. These last 2 decades, in this and many other wars across the Middle East, including Iraq and Syria, the guardsmen of the 50 states, the active militia of the states, have served as the backbone, accounting for nearly half of the total military forces. We already talked about how they were taken away from their families, but we have to ask this question: on whose authority did they go to war? Congress also has the authority to call forth the National Guard for 3 purposes. Senator Adams talked about them: to repel an invasion, to put down an insurrection, and to enforce the laws of the Union. Today, among other nations, our guardsmen are being used for an indefinite occupation of Syria. How does this fit within the militia clause? How does it fit? Article 1, Section 8. I would ask every member of this committee just to consider for a moment, are we suppressing an insurrection in Syria? Is the mission in Syria to actually foment an insurrection for the purposes of regime change? Going so far as to arm Al-Qaeda insurgents who became ISIS forces, who my brothers and sisters fought against. Our troops later had to fight the same people that we armed. I want you to understand how clear I'm saying this. We put the weapons in the hands of the people that we fought the next day. Is our mission there to repel an invasion? Syria is a sovereign nation, and our military is there uninvited. So if there's an invasion, we're not the ones repelling it. Was it to execute the laws of the Union? What laws? There's no declaration of war against Syria. Instead, the legal justification of war, and this is where the problem lies, is on two constitutionally unsound authorizations of use of military force, commonly referred to as AUMFs, one of which was passed to explicitly eradicate al-Qaeda. But we're arming al-Qaeda. We are in opposition. Our authorization that we're using to be there, which is not constitutionally sound, is actually in opposition to what we're actually doing. The Warhawks in Washington, D.C. love this, though, because it perpetuates the military-industrial complex. Remember, there was national outrage before we went to Syria. Politicians refused to even take it up. There was an AUMF that was presented to give the president authorization to go, and they refused to take it up. But we went anyway. The president said, forget it. We're going to go anyway. Elected officials were terrified of putting their name on the line because of the political blowback. So for 82 years, Congress has abandoned its constitutional obligations to declare war. So now it falls to the state. And here's why we're here today. It falls to the states, the ratifying bodies of the Constitution that created the federal government. It's our job to take up the charge of Daniel Webster, the United States Secretary of State, when he said it will be the solemn duty of the state governments to protect their own authority over their own militia and to interpose between the citizens and the arbitrary and overpowering authority of the federal government. In short, that's exactly what Senate Bill 1252 accomplishes. It interposes our state between our citizens and the federal government, and it forces the clear terms of our Constitution regarding overseas combat deployments for our guardsmen. Now, some of the objections you'll hear, and these are important to understand because they're very important. They're very powerful objections, and they're very valid. The biggest claim, and I understand it's probably weighing on some minds in this room today, is that passing Defend the Guard, there's a threat that access to federal funds will be lost and resources will be taken away. It's a very real threat. Personally, I'd like to know the name of anybody at the federal level who's making this threat and on whose authority, because it's not born out of the law. According to all the legal opinions that have been drafted in conjunction of this bill across the various states, this claim conflates requirements of the rules of Title 32 with the rules of Title 10. And I don't want to get into the weeds, but I'd be happy to answer any specific questions. But briefly, Title 32 is when guardsmen are activated under the authority of the governor, and Title 10 is when they're under the authority of the federal government, and they're using the rules of Title 32 to threaten us for Title 10 missions. And it's important to understand the legal distinction, and like I said, I'd be happy to answer those questions if anybody's so interested.
And for planning purposes, how close you getting?
Pretty close.
Okay.
Nearing the end. The fact that the argument of federal funding is even being made is a demonstration of the way in which authority has slowly been usurped by the federal government and the executive branch, which is the very issue of this legislation. The practical political reality of how unpopular it would be for presidents to defund the state National Guard, especially if it's due to the unwillingness of a president to go to Congress to get a declaration of war. That's literally all the president has to do is get a declaration of war, and then the National Guard's there. To further dispel the funding argument, we need to understand that our senators, Jim Risch and Mike Crapo, and our Congressman Russ Fulcher and Mike Simpson, would never allow a funding measure that stripped resources from the state of Idaho, considering that Mike Simpson is one of the most senior, most powerful members of the Appropriations Committee in Washington, D.C. They would never allow our National Guard, our militia, to be defunded in a way that would leave us vulnerable for actual, real Idaho defense purposes. There's also claims that this violates the Supremacy Clause, and I'm going to move through this one pretty quick, and that it violates principles of federalism. In reality, this restores federalism. It restores the separation of powers between the legislative and the executive branch, and it further answers the question of supremacy, that the Supremacy Clause is for the furtherance of constitutional orders by the federal government. If an order is not constitutional, we turn to the 10th Amendment. That becomes supreme. It's the state's authorities. Since the target of this legislation is the deployment of guardsmen who fall under the default authority of the state of Idaho, unless activated federally under Title 10, when those Title 10 orders are not issued in compliance with the clear requirements of the Constitution, we are clearly dealing with a 10th Amendment issue. I want to thank members of this committee for your serious consideration of this major question of interposition. While I personally am prone, naturally, it's my nature, to worry about the erosion of our constitutional system, including the unchecked growth of the executive powers over war making, which we're discussing today, the fact that committees of elected senators accountable to the people are still able to hear, consider, and decide these major questions is a testament to the endurance of our system. So to restate the question one last time, after 82 years of war with no declaration, should Idaho insist on the restoration of constitutional order by requiring members of the Congress to go on record with their vote in the affirmative for a declaration of war before we release our Idaho Guardsmen for their boots to hit the ground of a war zone on foreign soil? I say yes, and we have a duty to our men and women in uniform and to our own oaths to do the same. I stand for any questions, and I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. McKnight. Senator Taves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. McKnight. I understand that probably the most recent war that the U.S. has been officially in was when Congress voted for us to go to war in Afghanistan after 9/11. Would this bill have prevented the Idaho National Guard from fighting in that war?
Mr. McKnight.
Mr. Chairman, Senator, thanks for your question. That's actually a really good question, and the answer is yes, because the authorization of use of military force was the action that Congress took in 2001 to go to Afghanistan. What they did is they said, we're not going to decide, Mr. President. You decide, we'll write a check. That's what an authorization of use of military force is. It's not proper. We didn't wage war on a nation. We went to Afghanistan to eradicate 17 Saudis, right? So we didn't do it the right way. And we stayed for 21 years, and it cost us trillions of dollars and thousands of lives. This is exactly the situation that this bill is intended to combat.
I don't see any other questions. Thank you for being in committee, and thank you for your service.
Thank you.
Let's go with James Roenick, and if I pronounced that wrong, correct me.
Mr. Chairman, it's James Cronky.
Cronky, welcome to committee.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, Senators, I'm retired Sergeant First Class James Cronky. I served 21 years in the Idaho Army National Guard. I've deployed 3 times, once to Bosnia in 2003, twice to Afghanistan 2006, and 2012. Additionally, I took 8 months off from the Guard to be a Department of Defense contractor in Iraq. Because of my military deployments, I'm now a retired disabled veteran. In 1996, I swore an oath to defend the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of Idaho against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I didn't join Big Army. I didn't join the Army Reserves simply because I wanted to support this great state. My deployment to Bosnia was extended in 2003 for several days as the ramp up for Iraq began. After a couple of weeks of being home, I was glued to my TV, wondering if I could ever do my part. Would the Guard ever be called up to fight the front lines? I would never imagine how many times Guard would be called up to Iraq and Afghanistan. As a soldier, it's what you train for, taking the battle to the enemy so they don't attack us on our soil. With each deployment, my eyes widen more and more. Why are we still here? Why are we wasting taxpayers' money? And to what extent are we okay losing more American lives? Any questions like this would get an answer of, well, write your congressman. Little did I know that Congress wrote a blank check to POTUS, approving the use of military force in any scenario of conflict, whenever and wherever he deems necessary. So the Congress members that we voted for, that are in D.C. to represent this great state, to represent our Idaho values and ideation of what this country should be and do, that should have our best interests if Idaho citizens should go to war, have passed this big responsibility onto a single person. Let's say I wrote a letter to the president on the waste and abuse I saw in Afghanistan. Do you think that he'd read it? And if so, what merit would he give it? What if 5, 10, 50 soldiers wrote letters? What would it take to realize that taxpayers' money and American lives are being lost in endless war that'll never be won? Now, what if I wrote that same letter to a congressman? I'm pretty sure they would read it and my voice would be heard. Maybe there's a reason the Constitution says acts of war are to be decided by Congress and not the president. Please know I'm not against war. I feel we need to protect this nation and great state of Idaho. This bill will put order back the way it should be on such a serious matter, protecting Idaho service members from Congress passing the buck. Our Idaho service members need to know we have their backs. Thank you for your time. I stand for any questions.
I don't see any questions. Thank you for being in committee and for your service.
Thank you.
Thank you. Kent Burns?
Good morning,
Welcome
Mr.
to
Chairman.
committee.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, esteemed senators. My name is Kent Burns. I served 20-ish years in the United States Army, ended my career in the Idaho National Guard. In 2014, I deployed to Bosnia in 2001, 2003, Afghanistan 2005, 2007, and back to Afghanistan in 2009 to 2011 as a member of Task Force Odin, which was observe, detect, identify, and neutralize, which was as cool as it sounds. I am now retired disabled veteran and here to offer my support and lend my voice for the common sense legislation called Defend the Guard. The last time the U.S. Congress declared war was World War II, after Japan bombed Pearl Harbor and the U.S. declared war within 72 hours and immediately signed by the president. During the time between the attack and the signing of the declaration of war, Congress convened, discussed, debated, and represented the will of the constituents before making such solemn declaration. America is 11-0 in wars that have been declared by Congress. Fast forward to the next 80 years, America has been cast into wars without congressional declaration over and over and over again, including Korea, Vietnam, Lebanon, Iraq, Afghanistan, back to Iraq. So now I rhetorically ask you, what is America's win-loss record in the 80 years after the last declaration of World War II? Congress has the sole power to declare war. It says it right in the Constitution. I am not a constitutional scholar, nor am I a historian. I'm a simple disabled veteran trying to survive every single day, carrying the baggage and permanent gifts that my service to my government has bestowed upon me. Gifts that include, back and knees of a 70-year-old man, and a few mental and emotional scars that no machine or doctor can accurately identify or cure. I am here to show a human cost of war. I am here to tell you that I raised my hand and I swore an oath to the Constitution and promised to keep that oath, even if it would cost me my life. I am here to demonstrate that I have received. Excuse me, I apologize. Forgive me for that part. I encourage you to learn more about the Defend the Guard. The bill restores constitutional principles over the most solemn act a government can sanction, which is war and the immediate death of its citizens. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you, Mr. Burns. Maybe I do see a question. Senator Ruckte?
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, is it Burns?
Yes,
Mr.
sir.
Burns? I was hoping you could help me understand one thing. You have both active duty and then National Guard experience.
Yes, sir.
I served in active duty from 93 to 98 over in Germany. And I don't know if I'd call it just anecdotal. It was generally understood that the way the National Guard was used back then during that time period was they would often backfill positions. So say for example, a unit would be deployed, a unit from Germany, active duty unit, would be deployed to Africa for some real world mission. National Guard units would backfill the absence of that unit from their regular duty station to help continue, what they needed to do in Germany.
Yes, sir.
So it was a lot of backfill. National Guard units, I don't mean for this to sound like a criticism of National Guard, but they generally weren't very well trained because they're not doing the job full-time. They're doing it once a weekend and a few weeks a year. But I also understand after I left the military that that role changed significantly, and I was hoping you could just give me some, update me since '98. How does the National Guard get used?
Mr. Burns.
Mr. Senator, those were the years 93 through 98. That was post Gulf War one. The National Guard was used in that aspect to backfill and augment active duty soldiers that were going to the front. Post 9/11, that all changed with the AUMF and the president's decision on where to send the National Guard. And we had principal missions. The Idaho Army National Guard, first of the 183rd Attack Helicopter Battalion, we took over Fob Salerno. Fob Salerno is actually where Bo Bergdahl walked away from. And he's not a fellow Idahoan. It was a bad place. We had a very specific mission to go seek the enemy and kill them. And that's exactly what we did. We were not augmentees. We were not there to backfill. We were there to serve the initial mission, and that was to find the enemy and kill them.
Senator Wintrow.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you so much for your service and your testimony today. I appreciate it. I have my trusty iPad and just looked up the authorization use of military force that you mentioned, so thank you for that. So as you said, it was after, it basically denotes here after the September 11 attacks, as you noted, that it was now, but Congress enacted the right for them to use military necessary and appropriate for force against those determined planned, unauthorized, committed, or aided to those September 11 attacks. So is that authorization use of military force only for pursuit of terrorists that were linked to that specific air attack, or is it now being used broadly for terrorism worldwide?
Mr. Burns.
Mr. Chairman, Senator, I'm not exactly sure what the scope of the global war on terrorism is now, but as Mr. McKnight mentioned, we're in Syria. We're looking all over the place for all the terrorists. So I do not. Go ahead. And maybe the Senator Adams can explain that a little bit better than I can. I apologize. Like I said, I'm not an historian. I'm just a simple old soldier, broken down old soldier. And I thank you for your time very much.
And thank you for your time and your service. Don't have anyone else signed up. Is there someone that intended to speak to this legislation that was not successful signing up? Senator Adams, would you like to offer some close?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Again, for the record, Senator Ben Adams, District 12, Nampa. To Senator Winthrow's question, the authorizational use of military force as agencies from the federal government tend to do, it's been used broadly with, and it's been interpreted broadly. Although I would say I know that the majority of the Congress that signed that into law is no longer there. So unfortunately, they can't quite keep tabs on it. Mr. Chairman, I hope that answers your question. Mr. Chairman, something I heard during testimony that really stirred me up on this, call your congressman. I got the same thing when I came back from my second tour in Afghanistan. And if you were to ask the average citizen where this power is right now, they would say it's in Washington, right? However, Washington, the federal government, derives their powers from the consent of the governed. And we are the governed. And in this case, we are the legislative body that is entrusted with using our 10th Amendment rights to push back against federal overreach, which this legislature has a history of doing. And if we'll use it for water, and we'll use it for all these different other things that are very important, then surely we will use it to protect our state militia, our citizens, from being sent into undeclared wars with no end date. A congressional declaration of war gives clear definitions of victory. What we have currently does not. And this also goes to Senator Winthrop's question. The Idaho National Guard I mentioned was in Syria this last year, which is considered a combat zone. And when I asked to repel invasion, suppress insurrection, and enforce the laws of the Union, what law of the Union did we use to be there? What justified the Idaho National Guard being in Syria? I was told the 2001 authorizational use of military force. So, Mr. Chairman, the bill's before the committee. I respectfully ask that we send to the floor with a due pass recommendation. Thank you very much for your time.
I have a quick question for you, Senator.
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Trying to think through the reasons for the act of war not being declared. Is it, in your opinion, is it political optics? Does it indicate some kind of elevated thing and they don't do that because of the message it sends through the language? Or what in your opinion is the reason why they shy away from that declaration? Is it strictly for optical and political reasons?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. I've never been in Congress. I imagine a lot of it is political optics. However, this goes back to after World War II. We haven't declared war since then. We had Korea, we had Vietnam, we had the Gulf War. And I think part of it is, I don't have a clear answer for you, but I would suspect, and actually I would like to bring up General Eisenhower after World War II, who told us to beware of the military-industrial complex, a giant machine that is, frankly, hungry, and we've been feeding it for a long time.
So as a follow-up to that, does that declaration clear a pathway for an elevated use of force, including advanced weaponry? Is it along that line?
Mr. Chairman, when Congress declares war, it gives them broad authority not only to do things like restrict the sale of American companies to foreign governments, which has been happening in our steel industry right now. If we have an enemy, and Congress will actually stick their neck out, like they're asking our state National Guard to do, then yes, there are broad powers that come with that.
Don't see any other questions. Senator Ruckty does have one.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Adams. So I like the basic concept of this, which is that if Congress wants to send troops overseas, put them in harm's way, they should declare war. I mean, I totally understand that. Another thing I remember from my time in the military is we had a two-theater strategy. And essentially what it meant was at any given time, we knew we could be drawn into two theaters of war, and we had to be prepared to meet that moment. And that meant we had to have enough active duty units combined with National Guard units or wherever else we were going to get troops to be able to meet those missions and then still maintain all the other things that the military has to do. My understanding after I got out of the military was that the strategy started to rely more and more heavily on Guard units to fill that mission. And if we don't have Guard units available to the United States military to do its missions, then it means they have to rely more heavily on active duty. So more expense, more training. We start to increase our divisions back to probably post-Gulf War numbers before we started drawing down. So I mean, this gets really complicated, but it also reminds me that these are strategic plans that are made at the highest levels with a view to what the possible missions are throughout the world. And those missions, of course, are changing, every year, depending on who our most prominent enemies or potential enemies are. So this is a big deal. What you're talking about, I guess, is what I'm coming around to. And if you want to respond to that, it's not really a question, just kind of me thinking through stuff.
Senator Adams.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Recty, yes, I would love to respond to that. Nothing in this legislation restricts us from training missions or going to countries that aren't combat zones. The question that we have to ask ourselves is, are we at war or not? Because they're using the militia like we are, but Congress hasn't declared it.
Don't see any other questions. Committee, Senate Bill 1252 is properly before the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and committee.
Senator Winder.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just for a little discussion, if I might.
Senator Winder.
Noticed an article yesterday in the national news that the Army is forced with making some major changes in their force alignments, their organization, because their recruiting is down. 64,000 troops down, according to that report. Being a veteran of the Vietnam era, I was not in Vietnam, but my brother was in Korea. I served during Vietnam and saw the consequences of that in not just the military, but in society in general. And took many, many years to get recognition for our Korean veterans. It's taken many years for our culture to come around and support the Vietnam veterans, but I think it's because the Vietnam veterans said we're not going to let this happen to a next generation. We're going to stand up, we're going to show up, we're going to support our men and women that serve in the uniform. And so I think there's really a significant message in this. And I think that as you go back and look at the Constitution, the President is Commander-in-Chief, but it's only when those troops are called up. So who calls them up? Who has the authority to call them up? And currently, we've allowed the executive, in this case, the President of the United States, as designated Commander-in-Chief to do that, and with some, obviously, support from Congress. But has it really gotten us anywhere? I think in my opinion, at least we've been at war with terrorism. Most of it has been state-sponsored terrorism. We've chosen not to declare war against Afghanistan or Iraq or Iran, whatever it might be. I think because of the looks of it, the politics of it. And yet, when you don't make the commitment to identify and destroy your enemy, you're going to have the same kind of cultural confusion that we've had since Korea. And I think that, whether this gets out of committee or not, I really feel it's important to have this discussion and to really think about what's going on at the national level, what impact it has at the state level with the National Guard and Reserve units. They're putting them in harm's way, just the same as the well-trained units of the regular services. And I think that something needs to be said. I don't know I feel, in my personal opinion, this is one way of standing up to that and saying, hey, it's time for a change. We can't be at war for 100 years without having some major designation of an enemy and an effort to really eliminate that enemy. And we haven't done that since World War II. It's cost us thousands and thousands of our brightest young men and women. And our country's now trillions and trillions of dollars in debt, not necessarily just because of war, but because of other policies that are made at the national level. And I think this is a real important day of reckoning, if you want to call it that, for us to confront this issue of what I consider really poor national leadership for many, many generations. So I just put that on the table, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me to say that.
Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would move that we send Senate Bill 1252 to the floor with a due pass recommendation.
Motion by Senator Lee, second by Senator Taves, that Senate Bill 1252 be sent to the Senate floor with a recommendation that it do pass. Discussion on the motion. Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a difficult issue, but I think one of the things that's, in addition to the testimony, that's especially compelling to me is having the public conversation about what our National Guard is. And maybe we have now gotten to a place where people who sign up to serve know that there is a risk and that there is a requirement that you would be deployed. But I think that's a decision that we need to revisit to ensure that, as my father served 2 tours in Vietnam as an officer. He was drafted, or he had a low draft number, and so he chose to enlist so that his family could have some of the benefits of being an officer's family. And then when he came home, he did enlist in the Guard, and I think with different expectations. It's complex, but I think the conversation should be had. So thank you for allowing me to speak to my motion.
Thank you. Senator Anthony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the comments that have just been made. I'm kind of in that same vein. I listen to my veterans. I try really hard anyway. And what's presented before us is a debate that needs to be had, at a minimum. I'm going to support the motion to send it to the floor, and I'm going to reserve the right to reconsider when I get to the floor. I'm really doing some thinking about this. But what I do know is this. This is a debate that needs to be had. And I appreciate that my colleague, Senator Adams, is bringing a really tough issue to us, but one that I think as a nation we have to address. And when is it appropriate to deploy our young men and women? And under what legal mechanisms does that happen under the Constitution? And I am the reason why I pause here is because I want to understand all the ramifications. I want to understand what all this means a little bit better. But do I think that we should have the debate? Absolutely. And so I'm going to support the motion to send to the floor.
Wasn't sure who was first, but I'm going to go with Senator Burnt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm very sorry that I came in late. I was in a meeting with the speaker on the other side of the rotunda. Had some issues with taxes and stuff like that. So where do I start? This is a very complex issue, and I would be disingenuous to say that I know everything about it, because I don't. But I do know one thing. I have a lot of respect for the bill sponsor and those who support him, and he's pretty passionate about this issue. I'm not going to lie. This is something that means a lot to him. Senator Anthony said something that I truly believe in as well, is that, you have to listen to the veterans. And I've had a fair amount reach out to me, and I think that what's wrong with a discussion? There's nothing wrong with a discussion. There's nothing wrong with an honest debate on the floor. And so I support the motion. I'll be voting for the motion. and excited for this, where this goes. I do reserve the right to change my vote on the floor because along the way there will be a lot learned, and I just don't know where that's going to go. But I do believe that discussion is important. I appreciate the bill sponsor for bringing it to us this morning.
Senator Winthrow.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Senator Adams. I just really appreciate it too. And I too listen to veterans. My brother's a veteran, Marine, Army, Army Airborne, et cetera. He saw very bad action in Beirut, Grenada, Guantanamo Bay. And so I lived that secondhand as his sister, and so did my whole family. So please know I appreciate you and everybody who served active military. I think my hesitancy today is I do want a rich discussion, but I'd like to see more people in this room having that discussion so we can ask more questions. And I'd like to hear from some people in the federal government. I know that it was posted, but this needs more attention, I think, in this committee. I'm out over my skis. I'm trying to ask questions. Senator Adams has been great about coming to me and sharing information. I ask a ton of questions. I'm reading. I just don't feel like I know enough to make this kind of a step. I don't know enough about, I don't feel confident enough about what is our relation in the federal government and so forth. And security around the world. So while I so appreciate it, I just don't feel comfortable voting at this time. I don't think it's going to be a problem that you don't have my vote today. But I do appreciate the discussion. This is a big deal. So thank you for bringing it and starting that discussion. I do appreciate it.
And I, just for, those that are concerned about the fact that it's on the agenda, this bill has been on the website for a long, long time, and Senator Adams has been very methodical about when to bring this. So I do think the public has had the opportunity to be made well aware of this issue because it has been, it's an older bill number, so it's been out there a while. Senator Harris.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just listening to the testimony, I'll echo some of that and what some of the things that the pro tem mentioned. Over the years, Congress has taken a back seat to the executive, and the executive branch has glommed onto power, and it's been both parties that's done it. Anyway, I think this is a good bill. I think it's a good step in the right direction to kind of curb that authority that the executive has usurped, and I'll be supporting the motion. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Don't see it. Yeah, Senator Ruckty.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to vote for the motion, but I'll reserve my right to gather more information and listen to the debate. I too, even though I served in the military in Whit and West Point, and consider myself pretty informed on these issues. This obviously has federal implications, I think, way beyond anything that maybe we're fully ever going to be prepared to weigh in on unless we get, much more testimony and expert opinions. But I don't think it's a bad discussion to have on the floor, and so I'm comfortable with that.
Don't see any other, Senator Winder.
Just quickly, Mr. Chairman, back to the issue of, the hearing process, and, I think it's pretty loud that there aren't people here opposed to it. I know that there's some apprehension on behalf of some of the officers in the Guard that I've talked to, but this idea has been floating around now for several years. Senator Adams actually brought it forward when he was in the House. We had informational hearing on it previously. There's been a lot of opportunity for public input, and again, it comes down to you're hearing from vets that served active duty in the regular military services as well as the Guard, saying something's wrong, and hopefully we'll listen to them, and the rest of the legislative body will listen to them. It still has to go through the House. Obviously, there'll be other opportunities for public input, but I appreciate the committee and your support moving this to the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Not seeing any other discussion. Those in favor of sending Senate Bill 1252 to the floor with a due pass indicate by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Senator Winter will be recorded as voting no. Thank you, Senator Adams, and thank you for those that participated in testimony this morning and for your service, and for all those in the room that have military service backgrounds. Thank you as well.